Hey everyone, welcome to a new edition of Blogging Heads. My name is Eli Lake of the Washington Times. I'm with Wired Magazine's Danger Room, Spencer Ackerman, my good friend, and this is the day in Al-Qaeda. How are you today, Spencer?
I'm ready to take on Al-Qaeda, my friend. How are you?
Yes, we're hanging in there and a little hungover.
We're doing things that Al-Qaeda doesn't approve of. Later today, I'm going to make some music.
Yes, there you go. They don't approve of that, right. And they don't approve of drinking. But let's move on. Let's talk about, I guess I don't know if it's been an enduring debate between us, but a recent area where I think we diverge, which is the threat today as it relates to Al-Qaeda. And you have written a lot on the blog and a lot in your journalism that you think that it's pretty clear that Al-Qaeda is not capable of the kind of grand attacks of 9/11 or the multiple airline plot in 2005, or 2006, I'm sorry. Talk to me a little bit about kind of your notion of sort of what is the threat right now to the continental United States from Al-Qaeda.
What we're seeing increasingly are these, self-starter attacks. This is familiar to everyone from, Faisal Shahzad, from Omar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, from the thwarted Najib al-Azazi plot. Al-Qaeda self-starter recruits who can infiltrate, or in some cases already living in the United States, with freedom of movement, with a fair amount of leeway from authorities, who have more ambition than they have capability. And it's significant when you look at sort of what some of these attempts were. You had possibly, potentially the first ever car bomb attack using the sort of materials that we've seen in Afghanistan and Pakistan from insurgent and terrorist forces there. That was thwarted pretty much by the incompetence of Faisal Shahzad himself in May in Times Square. The plot that Omar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib came rather close to pulling off last Christmas. We saw, the underwear bomb. If it had been successful, it would have killed about 300 people in one attack, in a one-off. And, with some other patterns from the Zazi plot that didn't come out, from David Headley, from Major Hassan, who murdered 13 people at Fort Hood. What I think it sort of adds up to, and what the intelligence community and the FBI have been seeing it add up to, are basically a move away from the previous mode that Al-Qaeda has pulled off, not just in 9/11, but in Bali, in Spain, in London throughout the past decade, which is coordinated, simultaneous mass casualty attacks. We're talking about attacks with significantly diminished potential for mass killing. That's not to say there wouldn't be many deaths. I mean, had Abdul-Muttalib blown up Flight 253, 300 people would have died. That's a huge total. But it's still an order of magnitude less than on 9/11. And so you have to kind of wonder, when you look at Al-Qaeda's ability to proliferate terrorism outside of South Asia and outside of Yemen, outside of Somalia, we tend to see, we've been seeing over the last couple of years, and this is a good thing, a diminished capability. The further you get away from the center and out into the U.S. homeland periphery, there are things that the intelligence community is doing right. There are things that the military is doing right. There are things that surveillance-wise are going right. And it raises a bunch of questions about whether Al-Qaeda can ramp back up to what it would like to be. There's no doubt its intentions are greater. You still hear a lot of talk. We've heard some of this from the forthcoming Bob Woodward book, from the president, from John Brennan a lot, about the continued danger of nuclear terrorism, and that's still something that's not quite manifested. The same thing with chemical, biological. Increasingly, we're going to have to wonder about Al-Qaeda's cyber abilities. But we're looking at what appears to be a less capable but no less determined Al-Qaeda, and it raises questions about how our approach adapts in response.
All right, well, Blogging Head viewers, you've just heard the case for hope. Let me make the case for fear.
All right, make the case.
I'm going to make the case for fear. One, in 2007 and in 2008, most people in the intelligence community did not think that Al-Qaeda had the capability to attack us in the United States. Now that we clearly know that that's not the case. You're correct that the type of attacks, which have all been a product, it seems, inspired by Anwar al-Awlaki. He is connected to Nadal Hassan. He's connected to Abdul Muttalib. We don't know. I mean, it's more nebulous with Shahzad, but he's connected to him. But it seems to be the AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen, comprised of the kind of old Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia crew, has developed a signature kind of attack, and it's to inspire the lone radical gunman and have him sort of undertake fairly crude plots, and we have gotten fairly lucky so far. But to me, this also says that we're more vulnerable in the United States than we thought before, and not just because of the cases that you mentioned with Dash Zazi and others, but also we saw that a guy by the name of David Headley, who had changed his name, was arrested last year, had contact with a fairly obscure Pakistani ex-military general or special forces general named Muhammad Ilyas Kashmiri. I had a story this week past on looking at Muhammad Ilyas Kashmiri, and if you read through the court documents on Headley, you see that Kashmiri mentions this sort of sleeper network in Europe that can provide him with material, money, and ammunition for an attack on the Jyllands-Posten newspaper in Copenhagen, which in 2005 published the infamous or famous, however you want to say, Muhammad cartoons, and has been a target of jihadists since.
Can I also actually make a point on your point, strengthening your case, the case for fear? Before 2000, why not? Before 2009, we had not seen a case where an Al-Qaeda affiliate, not Al-Qaeda senior leadership in the Pakistani tribal areas, had exported a terrorist attack or a terrorist attempt to the United States homeland. And that all changed with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And it also raises questions. I've been trying to pursue this for the last year and not with much success, about whether we're going to increasingly see, we never saw from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for instance, and they were at one point a tremendously capable Al-Qaeda affiliate, an attempt to actually export terrorism beyond, what was the Jordanian attack they did? You know what I'm talking about.
That was in 2002. Oh, no, that was in 2005. You're talking about the multiple suicide bombings and the weddings,
Right.
That was a huge overstep for them, though.
Well, what I mean is, we even with their strength, and they were, we still don't know a fair amount about AQAP, but no one I've encountered believes them to be, stronger, had more freedom of movement than Al-Qaeda in Iraq did in like 04, 05. But nevertheless, they tried to go long, and so it raises the question of, Al-Qaeda's, Al-Shabaab affiliate in Somalia will try something like that. And we've seen Americans arrested in Minnesota, for instance, of trying to actually aid and abet, send fighters out to Al-Qaeda in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, I should say. We don't honestly know the tensile strength of that relationship back to Al-Qaeda's leadership. But
I would state that Al-Shabaab has their leadership has pledged allegiance to Sheikh bin Laden. I mean, I think that we can say that they're
right, but they also have a very local agenda as well. I just don't want, however you want to put it. I'm not trying to actually contest that point. I'm just trying to be cautious about it. But anyway, that's more for the case for fear. So please continue.
Well, I'd say that this guy Muhammad Ilyas Kashmiri is behind some of the most devastating attacks in Pakistan. The raid in Rawalpindi of the equivalent of the GHQ, the Pakistani Pentagon. He is largely credited with being one of the masterminds behind the Benazir Bhutto assassination, and his most gruesome work is seen in Mumbai in 2008, which all of these have a common characteristic, which are more sophisticated than the one-off Shahzad or Abdul Muttalib style attacks. They're coordinated sort of paramilitary team attacks. These guys are very trained. They are not suicide bombers, but they're kind of going in knowing it's a suicide mission, and they're very sophisticated. They're commandos, and if you look at the Mumbai attack, it's absolutely frightening. They take out the major sort of police headquarters, and then they go on their kind of killing spree, finding multiple targets from the kind of local Chabad to the Taj Mahal Hotel. And I'm saying that this kind of attack is, if you look at the testimony this week from Janet Napolitano, the Homeland Security Secretary, and Michael Leiter, they're saying that this is something else they're worried about in Western cities. And then I wrote about this as well as David Ignatius. You've seen European security chiefs this last few weeks talking about how it's code red, code red, code red. And Ignatius was trying to sort of make a point as to why the Obama administration is not acknowledging the threat and so forth. I think it's more interesting to sort of say, well, what's going on in Europe? And my sources tell me that the threat is very much connected to the concern about Kashmiri, who people believe is running a network, a sleeper network, that remains at large.
So here we should turn to the question of why, or at least try and construct a theory of this. One interpretation, one that Michael Leiter put forward in his testimony this week to Joe Lieberman's committee, was that ultimately whatever we're doing in the Pakistani tribal areas, and by which we're talking about drone strikes, we're talking about the odd raid, we're talking about Pakistani army harassment, things that are more widely covered in the press than they are publicly acknowledged by the administration, are successful at containing the threat from al-Qaeda senior leadership. And what that's led to are the increased demands on the affiliates to prove the resilience of the network. Another way of looking at it is that ultimately al-Qaeda senior leadership, as a lot of us, particularly counterterrorism experts affiliated with the left, argued during the middle of the last decade, that ultimately targeting these leaders doesn't contribute to the resilience of an American counterterrorism policy, because it's just too easy to export this from the affiliates. So we're kind of in a position where at least some of us on the left are kind of reaping the implications of an argument that they made when they were out of power. On the other hand, you do have to also look at capabilities, and this is the question that we started out with. What does it mean that they're less able to pursue these sophisticated or perhaps I'll put it more neutrally. What does it mean that we haven't seen as sophisticated an attempt on the American homeland as we've seen in Mumbai, as European security services, as you mentioned, are seeing right now in terms of the threat reporting? Is it just easier to pull this stuff off in Pakistan, in India? Right now there's a Yemeni offensive in the south against AQAP strongholds. Is it just it's easier to do this stuff in your own backyard, so to speak? Are these dry runs for what we should expect in the United States, or do we really have a more durable domestic defense after 10 years of doing this?
Well, it's one of those things, you don't know what you don't know. In the Najib Zazi example and the David Headley case, and there was another Canadian who was arrested with him, whose name I'm not recalling at this moment, the question remains, were these the only nodes of the network, the guys that we arrested, or were there other people that went to ground? And so from just the perspective of...
Well, with Zazi, they've always said there have been more people who went to ground. They've made further arrests, including...
Right, well, exactly. So with Zazi, and I think with... so the question is, what's the extent of the network? What is their capability? I mean, we know that there was a fundraising operation for Hezbollah in the 1990s in the United States. It's a matter of, it's a question mark whether those people also had an operational capability. Actually, it's funny because Michael Leiter said, when asked the question, that they did have an operational capability in the United States, and that's other intelligence people have said that before as well. So they assess in the case of Hezbollah that they don't have the desire at this point to attack the United States, but that might change if there was a conflict with Iran and Israel. But in the case of al-Qaeda, we know that they have the desire, and I guess the point I would make back to sort of the case for fear is that before 2009, we did not think that al-Qaeda had this kind of capability, and now we know that they did. And so, what else is it that we know or we don't know? And I don't know. And that's exactly where I want to leave it, Spencer, because I don't know the answer to that question of what more nodes there are in the network that we haven't detected. or that the U.S. counterterrorism authorities haven't detected. And then I want to just also get back to the point about decapitating leadership. My understanding is that in the case of Muhammad Ilyas Kashmiri, a talented commander in the sense that a kind of man talented in the military arts, he was able to sort of work his way up the chain in Al-Qaeda because we had decapitated so many other senior leaders. So sometimes the effect of the drone campaign in
catastrophic success, as they call it.
Exactly. It could be that you end up weeding out the dumb ones who don't know to not talk on temporary cell phones, right? And you end up empowering the ones who have good communication security. Right.
Ultimately, you also have to go to a related question, given that we're seeing, one thing that factually everyone should be able to agree on is that the operational tempo of al-Qaeda attempts on the United States homeland is up significantly since at least 2009. There's still, as you rightfully say, a lot of questions surrounding the whys and the capabilities and how that pattern is going to change. But we know that it's up, and we know that it's triggered. I think it's not exactly a secret. A rather extensive domestic surveillance and law enforcement and intelligence reaction. But one of the second order question is, given that we're seeing that, and given that we've also made a rather tremendous commitment in scope to the Afghanistan war, predicated on the idea of, as the administration has put it, dismantling and defeating al-Qaeda. The Afghanistan war is basically looking more and more peripheral to this concern. That if you want to take a charitable view of the U.S.'s war goals in Afghanistan right now, they're basically to just tamp down Afghanistan as a security, as its own security problem. So to eventually get to the point where the Afghan security forces are good enough to battle a diminished insurgency, so the United States can begin withdrawing its forces and focus in a more narrow way around containing, harassing, and disrupting the safe havens across the border in the Pakistani tribal areas. And if we're looking at I think Central Command wants to give $1.2 billion in military aid to Yemen. No one has any idea how or even why you could, to get to Somalia. But if we're looking at this proliferation outwards that looks a lot less connected to al-Qaeda's senior leadership in a durable way, at what point do we have to kind of reverse a line that many of us on the left, thought and still think was true about the Iraq War, that it was a distraction from the actual war against al-Qaeda, and now apply it to Afghanistan? Are we looking at a case where, because the resource commitment and the time commitment is so intense, that ultimately we're now looking at something less connected from that war, and ultimately raise questions about whether that has to change up, whether perhaps our footprint should come down more rapidly than General Petraeus thinks it should. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that the principle behind sort of the Iraq counterinsurgency and now the Afghan counterinsurgency, that we should have competent national security organizations that will bear the brunt of the fighting against al-Qaeda or against other enemies or be responsible, I should say, for kind of keeping security in an area, is a sound one. I don't think that the United States, as an advanced democracy in the era of sort of instant 24-hour communication and instant video, can do the kind of hard work that you would need to do kind of counterinsurgency with our volunteer army, because I just don't think that, at the end of the day, the kind of situations that you put our soldiers in is something that the American public, I don't think, can take if they sort of see too much of it. And so I think it makes sense to sort of say, listen, you need to fight for your country because al-Qaeda will destroy, your way of life as well, and it's sort of mutual, and we'll help you and aid you. And I think that is the Petraeus example. That said, whereas very optimistic, as you know, on Iraq, I'm somewhat less optimistic on Afghanistan. I don't have the benefit of, like you, gone go into Afghanistan where I did go to Iraq, and that may change my view. So I sort of am, tread lightly there. So I don't know if that's possible to pull off. I mean, the truth of the matter is that, Pashtun culturally is really very alien to, like, our values, as you know. And I just wonder, what is it like for the 22-year-old second lieutenant, whose psychological profile, like, you join the Marines, you join the military because you kind of want to help people. And then what does he do, Spencer, to be blunt, when he learns about the practice of powerful mullahs in that region, taking a young boy as a lover and making him effectively a sex slave, which is something that,
Right.
How does that translate? And I don't know the answer, but I've been reporting it a little bit, and I wonder sometimes whether that. No, I'm not making the Ralph Peters point here that they're icky. I'm just saying that, and I wish the best for the Afghan nation. I'm just saying that that's a very hard slog. That's very difficult to do, and I think the world of Petraeus and his command team, and I hope they can do it. But I just think it's very, very difficult.
Well, the question that I'm trying to get at, and I don't really have a stable answer for it yet. I'm just trying to raise it, frame it, and think it through. And I'm happy to have one of my best and smartest friends to help me with this. Is whether, regardless of the question of if we can pull it off, we're focusing more in Afghanistan on strongholds and areas in the south that are, however you look at it, just more peripheral to Al-Qaeda.
Okay. I hear where you're going.
And so, I don't have a good answer for this now. I mean, I can construct the answer that I've found and have found, satisfying for a fair amount of time. And increasingly, I'm worried. I'm dubious about it. I'm not sure if it's such a good argument that, at least you cut off Al-Qaeda's strategic depth in Afghanistan, its allies in the Taliban, the Haqqani network, and so forth. But the Haqqani network are in eastern Afghanistan primarily, and you're seeing an increased tempo of their operations somewhat in the east, where we're focusing on less. And then across the border, you have the primary locus of Al-Qaeda's presence, and there we have a peripheral, there we have a rather, more airstrike-based and indirect campaign against them. And if it's
but you're forgetting the Pakistan. I mean, in theory, stressing the in theory here.
I'm sorry. Go on.
In theory, the Pakistani military is supposed to be the lead of the counterinsurgency forces in that region.
That's why I said indirect. Yeah,
indirect, right. So, do you trust the Pakistani military? I mean, I certainly don't, but maybe you can trust elements of it. I think General David Petraeus' job is in some ways to say how great they are, but that's the idea, is that you don't just leave it. I think that the answer that, if we could have General Petraeus or one of his deputies here, what they would tell you in this response is that, well, we're trying to do counterinsurgency in northern Pakistan too, and that that's like an ink spot, and they'll move to southern Afghanistan, and by the way, the leadership of the Taliban is pretty bad too. And I think that just going back to my guy, Ilyas Kashmiri, he's on the board of directors for 7 jihadist organizations, from Lashkar-e-Taiba to the Houthis in Kashmir, and he's in so I think that there's a lot of these groups have connections to various kinds of organizations like this. So it's sometimes it's important to understand that the leadership of the Taliban in southern Afghanistan is also a threat in terms of terrorism. And along these lines, if you remember the Faisal Shahzad thing, who was it that took credit for it? It wasn't Al-Qaeda, it was Tehrik-e-Taliban.
That's right.
So but
the Tehrik-e-Taliban is in Pakistan.
They are in Pakistan, but my point is that let's not get into that. I think sometimes your side of the street gets into this thing where we're just going to narrow and just focus on Al-Qaeda, and I think that in this particular case there's a constellation of South Asian jihadist organizations, whatever you want to call them, that share personnel. I mean, David Headley,
and they also, and I'll make this point for you, because in this case it's rather salient.
Right.
They don't just share personnel; they share family. They're actually intermarried.
Yeah.
The tensile strength of their bonds has really been tested by the creation of familial ties, and that's the reason why in most people's assessment, the Tehrik-e-Taliban became just so powerful so quickly. And instead of this, rather tribal-based, specific grievance-oriented organization, suddenly they were on the march, to 100 kilometers, outside the capital of Pakistan. So, that's definitely true. We can't really be as granular when we're talking about Al Qaeda
right.
in Pakistan and still in Afghanistan. But still, we've got a strategy in Afghanistan that is at least notably Afghan specific. We had a lot of discussion in 2009 about how the administration was putting in place an AFPAC strategy, but in implementation and in its focus, it's really been increasingly southern Afghanistan, while eastern Afghanistan, previously, the way station between these two places had been the centerpiece of the struggle. Now the north in Afghanistan is deteriorating rather rapidly. So it at least raises some questions about strategy as the Afghanistan war relates to Al Qaeda.
If I could add, one of the things I think confuses strategically is that the military and ISAF, starting with McChrystal and continuing under Petraeus, is committed to an Afghanistan counterinsurgency, which means establishing local governments that are trusted by the population and are not going to steal from the population and rape their children and so forth. And I would say that it's pretty clear that the CIA is committed to a cover-your-bet strategy of maintaining relationships with very corrupt warlords, most notably AWK, Ahmed Wali Karzai, that is at total cross purposes with the military's position. And it's amazing that we kind of are doing both, don't you think?
Yeah, and I would two factors there.
Yes.
One, yes, I know. After hearing the Obama administration talk, so much about a whole of government strategy,
I know.
Once again, as we saw in the early days of the Bush administration, you have the military and the CIA really at cross purposes for what they want to accomplish in a certain area.
And by the way, maybe the CIA way is the way to go. Maybe it's just there's no chance we're going to get a strong government in Kabul. It's a fool's errand. So cover your bets and do the drones and get good local intelligence and work with a lot of really bad guys.
Well, something that I spent a bit this week reporting on, and these were the 2 points I was going to raise. One, it's not just the CIA that's pursuing a cover your bets strategy. It's the Karzai government. The Karzai government is looking to sue for peace for basically with anyone they can in the Taliban movement. And from Petraeus up to the Obama administration, there isn't a sense that there's really an alternative to that. If there's at all a chance of Karzai actually getting some receptivity from the Taliban there, if the host government says, whatever, however illegitimate, you and I might believe his election to be, nevertheless, it's a fact that, Hamid Karzai is the president of Afghanistan without an alternative. And if he says that this is ultimately the way the war is, going to end under his administration in his efforts, that's the way we sort of have to acquiesce to it. So that's one problem. The second one is, for a very long time in Afghanistan, we really didn't have a governance strategy at all, and we had a military strategy that was about holding together some form of harassment in eastern Afghanistan in these outposts in places like Nangarhar and places like Kunar province, in the woolly places of Afghanistan, and the CIA basically had by default responsibility for implementing what governance actually meant, which was buying people off. And if there's one thing that's a constant throughout CIA history, not just in Afghanistan, but certainly in Afghanistan and beyond, it's doing that. It's finding proxy fighters. It's finding local, what the British like to call wide boys, the corrupt, potentates and El Jefes.
But they also used to call Gurkhas.
Right. Giving them cash and getting them, when necessary, to get out of our way or look the other way. And we're probably doing something rather similar in Pakistan.
I think that's right. I mean, if I may, this sort of brings us to the last thing. I know you got to go, and I got to go too. It's kind of amazing to me that what's going on from the U.S. approach in Afghanistan involves a lot of kinetic violence. And yet, there is a tendency in the elite press and at our level, Spencer, to focus on girls' school and Three Cups of Tea and Greg Mortensen. And it was the same in Iraq, if you remember. And we've talked privately about this before, but I just thought at the very end here, it's kind of it's a kind of frustration, which is like, let's not pretend this isn't a war. Let's not pretend that it doesn't involve a lot of things that if you didn't have the context of it and you showed it on, and lots of people looked at it. I mean, as we saw with some of the footage that WikiLeaks put out 6 months ago from Iraq, but the way that we talk about it at home is as if it's just one big USAID mission with Greg Mortensen.
And,
you know what I'm saying?
Well, I get in this argument all the time in military circles and with my friends on the left. Counterinsurgency is not a kinder, gentler form of war. It is a close, bloody, difficult fight. Anyone who participates in it will talk about how extremely kinetic it is and how there ultimately isn't this distinction drawn between the model of needing to go and have chai with the local notable, and what's the famous quote from General Mattis. I come in peace. I didn't bring in artillery, but I'm begging you, with tears in my eyes, don't shoot at my Marines, or I will kill each and every last one of you.
Yes, I know. Well, Mattis is now the CENTCOM commander, right?
Right. Mattis is, along with General Petraeus, one of the architects of the military's, now regnant embrace of counterinsurgency. So it's a canard. It does, all of us. It does everyone in this country and beyond a disservice for us in the press and people in think tanks and the military itself to talk about counterinsurgency as if it's anything but a bloody and violent endeavor. It is many other things as well, but it is fundamentally a close quarters war. Petraeus likes to talk about the brotherhood of the close fight, and it's, I think, a rather eloquent certainly haunting phrase as well.
Well, I mean, it reminds me of this Mattis. I mean, in 2007, when I was embedding in Iraq, I was actually in Abu Ghraib, the area where the famous prison was under Saddam and then under the U.S. And we had a wonderful afternoon with the kind of local lieutenant colonel and some tribal sheikhs who had decided to side with the Americans, and they killed a lamb. Everybody was eating, and it was all very nice. And at the end of it, I'm like talking to the U.S. commander, and I said, "Well, do you trust these guys? Didn't you have a problem? You had to confiscate some weapons." He's like, "Well, we've got more firepower than they do." And it's like at the end of the day, it is still that calculus, and it is still war. And I sometimes think that we lose it in the euphemism when we talk about it.
All right. On this point, we have at least on this episode of Blogging Heads, broad left-right agreement against euphemism.
I think so.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Eli. Unfortunately, I've got to run.
Me too.
So we will come back to the next day in Al Qaeda, hopefully sometime soon.
All right.
And hopefully
thanks,
it will ultimately end with us never having to have another day of Al Qaeda.
Yeah. No. That's right. I agree. Okay. Thank you.
All right, man. Have a good day.
Good. You too.